In this week, we're going to look at the question of how we know that Adam and Eve actually existed. And what we want to do is actually begin with the question of the image of God. The image of God. Are there evidences that would show us that the image of God is real for today? As we look out at the world, if we look out at anthropology, do we see signs that there actually is the image of God imprinted on all human persons? Well, before we can answer those questions, we need to ask the question, what is the image of God? Now, many theologians have argued about this, but I really think it's splitting a lot of hairs. I'll say this at the outset. I'll just give you three different camps under which many theologians would identify. Number one is what's called the resemblance view. When it says the image of God, that is actually quite literal. The words image and likeness mean that you bear the likeness of the statue. Think of Genesis chapter 5, when we read about the genealogy of Adam to Seth. Seth is made in the likeness of Adam. So in this sense, the resemblance view would hold that we bear some kind of a resemblance to God. Now, this doesn't mean that we bear the image of some kind of a humanoid deity. That the image of God means that humans look physically like God. Why? Because, of course, God is an immaterial being. He is an infinite, unembodied mind. So, to bear resemblance with an infinite, unembodied mind doesn't mean that we resemble him physically. It means that we resemble him spiritually. So, notions like the intellect, the subject of morality, consciousness, volition, or will, those sort of things would be all captured within the idea of the resemblance view. Number two, the representative view, that humans are benevolent rulers over creation. The key word there is not malevolent, evil, wicked, tyrannical rulers over creation, but benevolent, good rulers. In the same way that God is a good ruler, humans were created in the image of a benevolent ruler to rule over creation. Three, the relational view. That when it says that we're made in the image of God, that means that in a relational sense, we bear a relational connection with God. Humans are made male and female, and yet they're called man, Adam. Now, which one of these views is true? I'm going to argue all three are true. All three are true. But I lean toward the first definition of the image of God, that we resemble God in the sense that we have such properties as the intellect, morality, volition, will, creativity, and so forth. Now, that's kind of what you would call an intrinsic aspect of the image of God. So, if someone was disabled, if someone went through an accident and they lost a significant level of their intellect or their volition or their creativity, this wouldn't erase the image of God. It would only deface the image of God. And all of us are defaced in the image of God to some degree. But if somebody can't use the image of God, that doesn't mean that they lack it. It just means that it's lying dormant. Now, it seems to me, in order to have the representative view that we're ruling over creation and the relational view that we can relate with others, we need the resemblance view. To say that, well, the image of God means our function, that we relate or that we rule. Well, congratulations. Yeah, I agree. But you can't rule and you can't relate unless you resemble God in the intellect, the will, and morality. So we see all three of these, but you can't get around definition number one. We read in Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This is the climax of Genesis chapter 1. Then we read, God blessed them, and God said to them. Whatever the image of God is, at the very least, it means that we are able to communicate with God that God can speak to us and we can understand him. And it says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. That would be the relational view. Be fruitful and multiply. And finally, rule over every living thing that moves on the earth. That would be the representative view. That just as there is a king, there are vassals. And the vassals represent the king in the kingdom. So the image of God is at the very least representative. But in addition to this, because we have that property of a representative connection with God, that means we also have the ability to represent him in the world as well as to relate with others. So one is an ontological property, something that we are, and the other two are functional properties, things that we do. Now, what is the evidence for this claim that humans were made in the image and the likeness of God? That if we could show that humans have this immaterial property to them, of the intellect, the will, and morality, and so forth, this would give an incredible plausibility structure to the idea that humans were uniquely and specially created by God. So before we get into the paleoanthropology and the genetics and all that sort of thing, we're going to look at the key to the past is often the present. What can we know in the present as we move back into the murkiness of the past? One thing we can know is that humans have a soul, an immaterial self. I'm what you call a mind-body dualist. Mind-body dualist. That we have a body, but in addition to having a body, we have what philosophers refer to as a mind, or theologians refer to as a soul. Those are the same terms. They mean an immaterial seat of the will. An immaterial seat of the will. What is the biblical evidence for this? The Bible teaches this. We read in Luke 23, verse 43, Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Today I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." Now hold on a second. That man on the cross later that day and that weekend and that year and up until today, he's buried in the ground. His body went to go either to a common grave or was thrown to the dogs or something of that sort. But Jesus says, you will be with me in paradise. What does that mean? It means that that man has a soul. That his body went to one place and his soul went to another. Acts 7:59, this is Stephen's defense, and he's being stoned to death by the religious leaders. And he called out to the Lord Jesus and said, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Or 2 Corinthians 5, verse 6, Paul writes, "While we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. I prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord." To be absent from the body and be home with the Lord. Who is home with the Lord? It's not your body. It's your soul in the present heaven. Philippians 1:23, "I'm torn between two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be better by far for me." Now, Paul at that moment had at least seeing through a mirror darkly, as he puts it in 1 Corinthians 13. He had some sense in which he was having a communion and joy with God in Philippians. He mentions the term kairo, joy, something on the order of 14 to 16 times. So he had joy with God, and yet he's saying, when I get to go be with God, it's going to be better by far. What that means is that Paul did not go through soul sleep. He did not die, and then at the general resurrection of the dead, he'll be raised, and it'll just be an intermediate period of 2,000 years, but to him, it'll feel like no time passed. No, he's saying, I desire to go be with Christ, which is better by far, even than the current joy I'm experiencing in the prison writing to you, Philippians. So this is a biblical teaching. There are some Christian physicalists that don't believe in mind-body dualism, and they're wrong. They're wrong about that, because that's not what the Bible teaches. All right, now here's our question for tonight. How do we demonstrate that this is actually plausible, that we have a soul? There's two different views. There would be the dualistic view that we have a body, a physical body, and a soul. And then there would be the monistic view, mono meaning one, and ism meaning substance, so monistic meaning one substance, that the idea that you have two substances, a body and a soul, is really just nonsense. That when you say that you have a soul and a brain, no. The brain is the soul, and the soul is the brain. These are fused. So this idea would say that you don't have an immaterial mind, a mind that uses the body. Instead, all you are is a brain. So we could think of this in terms of, the heart produces blood, and the liver produces bile, and the brain produces brain gas. It produces thoughts. It's pumping out thoughts. That's the organ in your body that produces thoughts. That would be a monistic or physicalistic or naturalistic view of this subject. That you're just one substance, matter, energy. It all comprises the physical. Then there's the view that you're an immaterial soul. So what this would mean is, if my brain was damaged, my soul would be hampered. So all the way back to the times of René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, that René Descartes, right? He was aware, even in the Middle Ages, he was aware of the fact that if you do damage to the brain, the physical organ of the brain, that's going to affect your ability to use the brain through the soul. So if you drink 16 shots of tequila, your soul will have difficulty using the brain. If you take a baseball bat to the frontal lobe, your soul will have a hard time using the brain. But that just shows a correlation between the mind and the brain. That doesn't show a causation. Oh, I hit you in the head with a baseball bat. Now you can't speak. That shows that you don't have a soul. Au contraire, mon frère. We would say that only shows correlation, not causation. What do I mean? Let's say that I was a master violinist, but you gave me a terrible, terrible violin. It's out of tune. It's awful. And I, as a master violinist, pick up that violin, and it's not a Stradivarius. It's something that you got down at the thrift store, and it's out of tune. And I start playing it. You'd say, oh, see, you're not a master violinist at all. No, I am a master violinist using a terrible tool. So, if the violin is damaged, the music is going to sound terrible. But if the instrument is working functionally, I'm mixing metaphors at this point, your soul will be able to use the violin, your soul will be able to use the brain. So there's correlation, but there's not causation. You'd have to show that one is actually causing the other. That can't be shown. All right. That being said, what is the evidence for the existence of the soul? I'm going to argue quite strong evidence. And if this is true, again, this gives an entire plausibility structure to the idea that humans are uniquely and specially created. Number one is direct first-person perception. Direct first-person perception of the soul. If we are purely physical beings, this would mean that free will is an illusion. But I have a direct first-person perception that I am free. And I treat other people through a direct first-person perception that they also are free. Let me give you a little syllogism here. Premise one. Every event in the universe is determined by natural laws. I think that's fair to say. Two, our thoughts and decisions are events in the universe. Where else would they be if not in the universe? Our thoughts and decisions, our will is inside the universe. Of course they're in the universe. That seems indisputable. Therefore, three, our thoughts and decisions are determined by natural laws. What this means is that all of your freedom of the will, on a physicalist view, if all we are is physical, natural, monistic, one substance, this would mean that our freedom of the will is just an illusion. I think you'd have to come to terms with that. So you might have certain thoughts, certain opinions, certain ethics, certain politics, certain aesthetic views. But in the end, it's just your brain being utilized by natural laws. Like if I grabbed a bottle of Mountain Dew and I shook it, and I grabbed a bottle of Dr. Pepper and shook it, both of those would be producing fizz. And so maybe you fizz Dr. Pepper and I fizz Mountain Dew. But whatever our thoughts are, they're just fizz, brain gas, and nothing more. Now you say, wait a minute. You're comparing our brains to Mountain Dew and to Dr. Pepper. Our brains are way more complex than that. Our brains are constituted of 100 billion neurons. Each neuron has 7,000 synaptic connections to the others. An incredible matrix in your brain, just in your skull. 10 to the 15th number of synaptic connections, and you're comparing that to Mountain Dew and to Dr. Pepper? Yes, I am. I will honestly and quickly admit that the human brain, is vastly more complex than just about anything in the universe. But is it any more free? Given naturalism, given physicalism. Let's look at this for a second. Here's an illustration. We got two different options here. Option one is 8 dominoes. And you knock those over, and okay, there it is. Option 2 is a track of 15,000 dominoes. Which is more complex, option 1 or option 2? Let's vote. Option 1, option 2. Option 2, correct. Which one is more free? Neither, yes, no, it doesn't matter. Neither are more free. It's a nonsensical question. What if I added a 9th domino to option 1? Would it make it more free? What if I added 10 dominoes? What if I added 14,990 dominoes to it? That makes it more free. What if I multiplied the dominoes on the right rather than on the left? These are physical. It's matter and energy. That's all that it is. So too with our brains. Well, our brains are more complex. Yes. Are they any more free? Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. This is why many atheists will say that free will is an illusion. Free will is just an illusion. Free will is an illusion. It's a useful illusion. It is a grand illusion. Thinking about things is an overwhelmingly powerful illusion. My question for these thinkers is this: if it's an illusion, who is being deluded? Like if I gave you a glass and I put a pencil into the water, you would say that's an optical illusion. The pencil comes down at a certain angle, but then there's a second pencil, so I'm being deluded. But I am a conscious agent viewing the delusion. If consciousness itself is a delusion, who is being deluded by it? A conscious agent. So even if we are being deluded, that actually doesn't disprove consciousness, it proves it. It proves that we're aware of the delusion itself. Here's Jerry Coyne. He speaks about this. See what you think.
Now, many of you probably don't accept that. You don't believe that your robot's made out of meat, which is what I'm going to try to convince you of today. But I just want you to think about it, okay? We have no more free will than a bowl of sugar. And I firmly believe that, because we are bowls of sugar, just very complicated ones. And we have nucleotides and proteins as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. Bowls of sugar. Okay, so we're basically, what is that saying? We're robots made out of meat. We are just physical, and that's all. Well, that's consistent. I'll tip my hat on that. If you think that we're just physical, then yeah, like reducibly to just proteins and nucleotides and so forth. All right. If we are purely physical, then reason is an illusion. Reason is an illusion. Why? Well, let's picture these two debonair men. They're talking to each other, and the first one says to the other, "Can I trust you? Are your conclusions reliable? Are you telling me the truth?" And the second one pulls out a magic 8-ball. And every answer that he gives, He reads from the magic 8-ball. So, can I trust you? Are you reliable? Are you telling me the truth? And he shakes the magic 8-ball, matter and energy, and what comes up, you may rely on it. And the first man says, whew, glad we got that solved. But then he says, wait a minute, shake it again. So the second man shakes it again, and it says, most likely. Most likely. I thought I could rely on it. Wait a minute. Shake it again. So he shakes it again, and it says, better not tell you now. Playing coy, eh? Well, why don't you shake it one more time, pal? And he shakes it again. Very doubtful. Oh, very doubtful. Shake it again. My reply is no. If everything that the man is saying is being controlled by an object that is being controlled by energy acting on matter plus time plus chance, could you rely on his words? You say, no, of course not. That's silly. If all of us have magic 8-balls in our head, you couldn't trust what they say if they're just shaking around and producing thoughts. Now, here's the issue. If you cannot trust the mind, quote unquote, controlled by the blind forces of natural law in the magic 8-ball, why would you trust the mind of a human being controlled by the blind forces of natural law? Again, you're saying that the magic 8-ball is the same as the human brain? No, I'm not saying that they're the same. I'm saying that they're qualitatively the same. They're qualitatively identical. If all we are is physics, if all we are is matter and energy, yes, they're qualitatively identical. They're quantitatively vastly different. A whole complex of algorithms in the human brain, greater than any supercomputer, to be sure. But what we're seeing here is that qualitatively, you can't trust the quote-unquote mind of a brain that is controlled by natural law. What about the idea of morality? Morality would be an illusion. Morality would be an illusion. Did anyone else get woken up last night at 4 a.m. to that tornado warning? Oh, I was scared to death. Oh, it was so terrifying. And then I found out it touched down in West Jefferson, 40 minutes away. Why did you ruin my sleep? Anyways, side point. What if I was outside walking down the street and a tornado dropped down and it hurled me at 80 miles an hour across the street and I bumped into a woman and I knocked her off her feet and so on and so forth? Would I be responsible for that happening? No. Why? Because matter and energy acted on me, and then I acted by being thrown like a puddle of pale skin and flesh across the street to hit the woman. Energy acting on matter, energy acting on matter. I'm not culpable for what I did because a blind wind came through and knocked me into her. Here's the question. What if all of our actions, us included, are just like the blind wind? What if we're all just materialistic tornadoes bumping into each other? Well, then the things that we do aren't really things that I'm doing. They're things that are actually caused, that are antecedent to me. The way I was raised, my upbringing, my genetics, my circumstances, all this. There's no point at which you could say that I'm culpable for anything. Now, just a quick caveat. Is it true that our upbringing, our genetics, the way we've been treated, affects how we impact other people? Oh, to be sure. And the Bible teaches that the sins of the father go down to the third and the fourth generation, that there's a social aspect of sin that you carry with you. We're affected by culture and circumstance and genetics, but are we determined by them? That would be the view from a physicalist perspective. There's no way out of this. Here's Richard Dawkins. He says, when a computer malfunctions, we do not punish it. We track down the problem and fix it, usually by replacing a damaged component either in the hardware or the software. Isn't the murderer or the rapist just a machine with a defective component, or a defective upbringing, or a defective education, or defective genes? Why is it that we humans find it almost impossible to accept such conclusions? Good question. Why do we vent such visceral hatred on child murderers when we should simply regard them as faulty units that need fixing or replacing. My dangerous idea is that we shall eventually grow out of all of this and even learn to laugh at it, just as we would laugh at a man when he beats his car. But I fear it is unlikely that I shall ever reach that level of enlightenment. Child murderers, rapists, he's saying that eventually we should get to the point where we laugh at that. The idea that they deserve justice. That we should reach a level of enlightenment to the point where we could say, oh, they're just biochemical machines with a brain and a central nervous system, and they're just the same as when a computer doesn't work or a car breaks down. You don't attack the car. You don't put the car in prison. You don't perform any kind of justice on the car. But under a physicalist, naturalist, monistic perspective, that all we are is matter and energy, that is precisely right. There's nothing wrong with what he's saying. Finally, what about the idea that you, when you were born, is the same you that sits here before us today? Lifelong identity. Who was born? Who was born when you were born? Was it you? No. It was a look-alike. Because every single part of our body is being replaced second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, year by year. Within 7, 10, 15 years, almost all of the cells in your body have been completely replaced. And you say, yeah, but they're mostly identical. Yes, yeah, sure. Because you look the same, right? And it's very little amounts of mutation that happen with cell replication. Sure. But they're not the same physical entities. They're lookalikes. So the person sitting before you today is a lookalike from who was born years ago. Let me give you an illustration. Imagine that you're a history buff and you're really a history buff over JFK. And you go to the museum, you pay $25, and you want to see the car in which JFK was assassinated. And you finally go up and see this, and you've been wanting to see it, and you get before the car, and you look at the car, and you have the audacity to move the velvet robe across, and you actually get behind it, and you start to look in at the car. Wow, this was the car that JFK died in, or he was shot in, rather. But then you start to look a little bit closer at that car, and you say, wait a minute, and you kick the tires. Hey, those are new. Those aren't from 1963. Those tires, those are brand new. Okay, let's not make a big deal out of it. They put new rubber on the car. That's fine. But then you start to look at the paneling. It's plastic. Now, wait a minute. The car that he was shot in was metal. They replaced the body of the car with plastic. Then you start to get suspicious. And you look inside the car. All the leather has been redone. You look up. All the upholstery has changed. Then you get really bold and brazen. You pop the hood. You get underneath the hood. There's a Honda engine, okay? Transmission. All of the pieces of that car have been replaced. Let's even say this. Let's say all the pieces of those car were replaced with 1961 Lincoln Continental parts, identical parts. Would that be the car in which JFK was shot and later killed? I'd be asking for my money back from the museum, wouldn't you? Because that's not the same car. Well, what's true of the car is true of you. That, I don't know, have you ever have regrets over the past? Like usually at high school reunions, that's where it comes up. You start to think of yourself and what you were like, and oh, I regret that so much. I regret that I did that I said that I behaved that way. Why are you regretting anything? That wasn't you who did it. That was a lookalike. Do you ever fear the future? Like, do you ever fear retirement or fear a surgery, fear going to the dentist? Don't worry, you won't be there when you get there because it'll be a totally different aggregate or composite of physical cells, and it won't be you under a materialistic worldview. It's only if we have a spiritual dimension that we could even begin to say that we are the same enduring self throughout our lives. If all we are is physical parts, it is patently obvious that we are not the same person. So, free will is an illusion. Reason is an illusion. Morality is an illusion. Lifelong identity is an illusion. Or naturalism is the illusion. How about that? Why are we so committed to this ideology of naturalism that we would be willing to throw away the direct first-person perception every second of every day that I am indeed conscious and that my free will is persistent, that there is morality, that I am the same person that I was a year ago or 2 years ago? Yeah, being committed to naturalism at that point, that would be, I'll just say this. Minimally, that would be a high price to pay just to hold on to your naturalistic worldview. Number 2, there's philosophical evidence that we have a soul. This is referred to as Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. You say, what? Okay, let me translate. The law of identity. The law of identity. This law says this: whatever is true of A is also true of B, and whatever is true of B is true of A if A and B are identical. So if A has a property X, then B will have the property X. And if B has the property Y, then A will have the property Y. You might not follow. Bruce Wayne and Batman. Whatever is true of Bruce Wayne must be true of Batman if the two are identical. Right? So, if Bruce Wayne is 220 pounds and Batman is 160, then we know that Bruce Wayne is not Batman. If Bruce Wayne is 6'2" and Batman is 5'6", we know that Bruce Wayne is not Batman. Why? Because whatever's true of A needs to be true of B, whatever's true of B needs to be true of A. If you could find something that's true of Batman that's not true of Bruce Wayne, or vice versa, you would know that those are not the same persons. You with me? So, eye color, ethnicity, scars on their body, strength. Now, please don't nitpick this and say, well, what if Batman put in colored contacts? Okay, what if he had his scars removed? Okay, you know what I'm talking about here. Whatever's true of A needs to be true of B, and that's Leibniz's law. Now, it seems very straightforward. If these two objects are the same, they need to share all the same properties. There's no way around that. Now, is that true of the mind and the brain? If we could show that there was something true of the mind, that the mind has a certain property that the brain does not, we could show that the mind is not the brain. Just as clearly as we could show that if Bruce Wayne was 220 pounds and Batman's 160, that they are not the same person. If something is true of the mind that's not true of the brain, they are not the same. In my mind, I can formulate certain propositions that 2 and 2 make 4, that a bachelor is an unmarried male, that Joe Biden is the president of the United States, that the earth is flat. Oh, wait, that's a false proposition. All those others were true propositions. The mind can formulate thoughts that are either true or false. But the electricity and the matter and the neurons and the brain cannot be true or false. They just are. You can't look at a neuron or a synapse and say, that's false. Or look at a neuron and a synapse and say, that's true. So too, when I'm perceiving the world and I'm having a thought that I'm looking at a light that's very bright. Wow, that's really bright. That's true in my mind. But is there a part in my brain, if a neurosurgeon dug in there, that also would be bright? I'm thinking of my mother, having a memory of my mother. She's in the living room wearing a red dress. What color is her dress? Red. My thought is having a thought of my mom wearing a red dress. Is there a part in my brain that is red? I'm thinking of the Statue of Liberty, and I'm thinking it's 310 feet. Is there a part in my brain that is 310 feet? Shape, size, color, truthfulness, veracity. All of these things are true of our thoughts in our mind, but have no correspondence in our brain. What does it mean? It would be like arguing that Bruce Wayne is 220 pounds and yet he's also Batman when he's 160 pounds. These two things cannot be the same. Well, we could add to this list if you wanted me to continue. The mind has a will, the brain doesn't have a will. The mind has morality, the brain does not have morality. The mind has persistent self-identity, lifelong identity that endures. The brain does not have that. It changes the neurons and the structure and the cell regeneration over time. We could go on and on and on, but for the sake of brevity, why don't we go on? Number 3, evidence from neuroscience. Now you might say, wait a minute, I thought neuroscience disproved the existence of the soul. No. Neuroscience did not disprove it. Actually, there's a vast wealth of data that show that neuroscience is demonstrating the reality of the mind or the soul. Dr. Adrian Owen in 2006 did an experiment with severe comatose patients. Severe comatose patients. In the experiment, Owen would ask audible questions to these severe comatose patients. I want you to think about playing tennis. I want you to think about playing tennis. Then he would speak to a person who was alive and active, the control group, and he would say, I want you to think about playing tennis. I want you to think about playing tennis. He hooked both subjects, the comatose patient and the normal patient, up to an fMRI brain scan. He found that there was no discernible difference in the fMRI. That when the words were ushered from his mouth, they had the same effect on the comatose patient as the patient who was alive and well. Now, people came back and said, sure, when you get yelled at by Adrian Owen in the ear, it's going to produce some kind of a mental shock, and if you get yelled and you're conscious, it's going to produce a mental shock. But it's not that they're actually thinking. Owen did the same experiment, only he used gibberish on the comatose patients. Up sideways statue goes round. Up sideways statue goes round. No response on the fMRI. Only when he said something to the effect of, think of something that's actually real. Think of your loved ones. Think of playing tennis. Think of exercising in the gym. But when he spoke gibberish, there was no response from the fMRI. He said this in the popular press, quote, 15 to 20% of people in the vegetative state who are assumed to have no more awareness than a head of broccoli are in fact fully conscious. Another example, the ability to distinguish between action from my will and brain stimulation. This goes back about 50 years to the scientist Wilder Penfield. After this study, he moved from being a physicalist to being a substance dualist. He says there's a mind, in other words. What did he find? This is what he found. He writes this, quote, when I have caused a conscious patient to move his hand by applying an electrode to the motor cortex of one of his hemispheres, I have often asked him about it. So he would hook up the brains and prod them with an electrical response to a certain part of the brain to elicit a certain response, to jerk their arm, to speak, to twitch. I've often asked the person after I performed the electrical prod. Invariably, the response was this: I didn't do that. You did that. When I caused him to vocalize, he said, I didn't make that sound. You pulled it out of me. Now, wait a minute. If the mind is the brain, if the brain is producing the mind, then how can someone say that you're producing electricity in the brain and saying, no, I know what that is. This is something different. I'm actually thinking, how can your brain be against your brain? In other words, how can your brain have an awareness of your brain? That implies consciousness. Cases of split brains having one center of consciousness. This is Roger Sperry's work. He would split the brain, the hemispheres of the brain. the neurons, the bundle of neurons between the brain, he would literally cut those in half so that the two hemispheres of the brain would be distinct, not having a connection with one another. This was for the purpose not of being a mad scientist, but for epilepsy. The patients with epilepsy was so strong, he thought he could reduce it, and in fact, it works. It helps with severe epilepsy. This being the case, what would one predict on the physicalist model? You would predict that now you would have either be dead, or you would predict that you would have two centers of consciousness. Instead, the intellect and the will were unchanged. And only subtle changes in perception were discovered through rigorous research. In order to tell a person apart, one who has had split brain surgery from someone who just has their brain together, two parts of the brain separated versus an integrated whole brain, Sperry had to do intensive, rigorous scientific tests showing reach for the pen behind the sheet, reach for the apple, feel the apple, all these different tests to discern. They can't relate one part of the brain to the other. Now, what does that show? Again, it's the violinist holding the Stradivarius versus the violinist holding the violin from the thrift store. The brain is damaged to a certain extent, but, and here's the key part, but what we didn't find is that the will was split. That means that the soul is indivisible, but the brain is divisible. Remember the law of identity? You can split the brain in two, but you can't split the soul in two. 2, 4, 6, 8, those have the property of being even. You can't reduce those. The same thing is true with the will or the soul. It can be hampered through the brain, but it cannot be divided into two separate intellects. Oh, the field of study I find very, very interesting, not just on a metaphysical level, but also on a practical level, is the burgeoning field of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, meaning that your mind, your brain, is plastic. It can change. The leader of this in the literature is Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. He was working with Leonardo DiCaprio. He was brought in to work with him for the movie The Aviator, where Howard Hughes has OCD. And Leonardo DiCaprio said, I want you to teach me how to behave as though I have OCD. And Jeffrey Schwartz said, no, I won't do that. I'm going to give you OCD. So Leonardo DiCaprio was like, that is the best character acting I could have. So Schwartz taught him how to have OCD. And then he taught him how to get rid of that OCD. Here's what he found. The brain differences, the physical structure of the brain changed in OCD patients from 10 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy. So before they did any kind of CBT, this part of the brain, the RCD part of the brain, which is overactive in OCD patients, was this big. You see the yellow part? Okay. After 2.5 months, that part of the brain shrunk substantially. In this test group, he didn't use medication, nothing physical. He didn't use a change of diet, nothing physical. He didn't use exercise, nothing physical. He taught them to reframe, reuse, I can't remember, it's the 4 R's, to rethink their OCD. And by doing so, their thoughts, catch this, their thoughts changed their physical brains. When J.P. Moreland was here, he's the leader in the known world of substance dualism, the belief that we're a mind and a body. He goes so far as to say, I am a soul. I have a body. That's pretty far. I don't know if I would go that far. I am a soul. I have a body. J.P. Moreland was here, and he was teaching us, and he said, I was asked to go debate this man, the head of neuroscience on the West Coast, UCLA, Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, and they wanted to put the scientist against the philosopher. And halfway through the debate, I realized that this man agreed with me. And it turned into just a wonderful conversation between me and Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, because he said, well, yeah, of course, there must be a mind because it acts on the brain, and then the brain changes. So the brain can't change itself any more than you can pull yourself up by your metaphysical bootstraps. So Moreland and him started to talk. Later, Jeffrey Schwartz came to faith in Christ, and the way Moreland put this was, he is on fire for God. Jeffrey Schwartz, neuroplasticity. Finally, near-death experiences. If we could show that when the brain or the body is turned off, if we could even show, this is the minimal example, if we could even show that you had any consciousness, whether it was true or false, whether it was a dream, an illusion, a hallucination, if the body is turned off, but you're still having consciousness, that would demonstrate that the mind and the body are not the same. Near-death experiences. These are not rare. 1 out of 25 people in America have had a near-death experience. As you study the literature, there's hundreds of millions across the world. This is not just a Western phenomenon. Across the world, you have near-death experiences. So 1 out of 25 people, well, that's not a lot of people. Wait a minute, 340 million people in America? That's 20 million people have said they have this experience. That's a lot of experiences. That's a lot of data. When people have a near-death experience, they say that their consciousness is enhanced. Now, if the brain was dying and you were going through hypoxia, let's say, there's no oxygen to the brain, and let's say it's producing all sorts of adrenaline and cortisol and all sorts of chemicals and hormones as you're dying to keep you alive, and it's producing all of this in your brain, you wouldn't expect your consciousness to be enhanced. You would expect the dying brain to be hampered in your consciousness. And yet we see exactly the opposite. People reporting near-death experiences are saying, actually, my consciousness was clearer than in my entire life. So much so that Kenneth Ring, who is a researcher in this field, said that people who are congenitally blind and congenitally deaf can see and hear during near-death experiences. That man, he had a striped tie. That doctor had a scar on his left cheek. They said this, they said that. They joked about how I'm about to kick the bucket, stuff like that. Now, wait a minute. If your mind is the same as your brain, how could you be able to see and hear anything? What's interesting about this is that repeatedly you see 3 things in near-death experiences. Number 1, the person encounters a being of light. Very, very, very often a person. And the description is that the person is glowing, that their clothing, every fiber is electrified, that it's brighter than the sun, and yet you can look right at it. Number 2, they also find that people with near-death experiences go through what's called a life review, where the being of light takes them through every good thing and every bad thing that they've ever done. And people who've gone through this literally say it's so aversive that they plead with the being of light to stop. Please stop. And yet the being of light comes toward them and says, no, you're deeply loved. Even though you did this and you did that and you did do it, you're still deeply, deeply loved. And finally, most importantly, the being of light states a universal message of love, that the only thing that mattered in your life was that you loved other people, and your love relationships are all that matter. Now, what I will say is this. There is no description, according to John Burke. He's written the seminal work on this, Imagine Heaven. He studied thousands of near-death experiences and studies and across the world. There are no examples, according to Burke, where the person meets a blue-skinned deity. There are no examples where they see a 3-eyed deity from Eastern tradition. There are no examples of annihilation. There are no examples of reincarnation. Repeatedly, they see a being of light who encounters them, gives them a life review, and then eventually tells them a message of love. When I first studied this, which was at this point 2013, 11 years ago, I read a handful of books on near-death experiences. The thing that troubled me is there were very, very few hellish experiences. The thing that bothered me was, if these are true, if these people are telling the truth about this, why does everyone go to heaven? Well, in the last 10 years, what they've shown is actually that 23% of people reporting NDEs say that their experience was terrifying or despairing. That when they went into the NDE, read some of the literature on this. It's very lurid, very terrible. And you ask the question, well, why would anyone not share about a description of a terrifying NDE, like an example of going to hell or an experience such as that? Burke's response, because nobody would want to share at the dinner party, hey, when I died, I didn't see the bright light. I went the other direction. That would be profoundly embarrassing. Other examples I read at the time, this is years ago, was one case was a man who was totally shocked. He sat up straight out of the cot as the ambulance was going by. His face was white. His hair was on end. He was totally shocked. He was screaming, "Get me out of this torture. Get me out of here. Don't ever send me back here." And then when they interviewed him later, he couldn't remember any of that. So Michael Sabom said, it's likely that these experiences are so dramatic that people actually suppress any kind of negative near-death experience. Finally, and this is the most important part, they have verified, corroborated details. Verified, corroborated details. In the literature, they call these veridical experience. Think of the word veritas, truth. It's not just that they're having dreams of heaven and hell, a being of light. We can't confirm that. Okay, you had that dream, you had that vision. I don't really know what to say, okay? But they also have verified, veridical experiences that actually connect them to the real world. Like what? Like one woman had a near-death experience, viewed her body from 20 feet in the air, and she woke up and said, there's a sticker on the top of the ceiling fan in the surgery room. It's a red sticker. It's on one of the parts of the fan. They pulled out a ladder 13 feet up in the air. There was a sticker. Another example, the woman said there is a Converse All-Star shoe. It is on the top third floor of the hospital. It's hidden from the ground level, but if you go up there, you'll see it's on the eastern part of the building, and the shoe is there. Just to placate the poor, recovering, near-death experienced person, they went up to the third floor. There it was. And on and on and on it goes. Studies have been done on this. You say, well, they know that they got the paddles. They know that they were intubated nasally or orally. They know they got shot with certain adrenaline, and they know all the chest compressions, all that kind of stuff. How do they know that? Well, they watched ER. They watched House. They watched Grey's Anatomy. And they just guessed. They just said, well, yeah, it's probably the case that I probably got the paddles. In fact, my chest kind of hurts. Probably got the paddles. Burn marks. Got the paddles, yeah. Or my chest, when they do chest compressions, it breaks ribs. Chest is sore. They probably, yeah, doc, I know you did that. They compared the near-death experience group with a control group that said, I didn't have a near-death experience. The control group was all over the map. The near-death experience group, 92% were surprisingly accurate and were completely accurate, surprisingly accurate descriptions compared to the control group. 92% were completely accurate. 2% were totally wrong. 6% were kind of in the middle. These are veridical experiences. I know that you were there. Let me give you just one example. Pam Reynolds. Write that down. Pam Reynolds. Early 90s. Brain aneurysm. They said we need to do a stand-still operation. What does that mean? Very, very, very dangerous. They cool the body of the patient down to 60 degrees. Feel an object on your table or your chair right now. Just grab it. Touch it. Okay, that's 70 degrees. Just imagine if you reached out and felt a body and it was 10 degrees cooler. They cooled her body down to 60 degrees. They drained the blood from her brain. No EEG, no EKG readings, no breathing, no brain waves, no heartbeat, no breathing. She woke up from the near-death experience able to explain everything that happened in the surgery room. One example was, and Michael Sabom was a skeptic of this, a doctor, later ended up writing a book on near-death experiences. He came forward and investigated this entire thing. Now remember, this is the 90s. This is before the internet, right, where she could look this up. He came in and he said, well, what did you see? And she said, well, that one doctor, Dr. So-and-so, he had a bone saw. Okay, what did it look like? It looked like an electric toothbrush. and it had a really high whizzing sound, a really loud noise to it. And it had two scissor saws, and that's how he worked on my brain. Well, he looked at the medical report, Sabom, and he looked at what kind of saw was used. Well, the Midas bone saw. He looked up the manual. What does the Midas bone saw look like? He compared it with her drawing of the bone saw. They were identical. At one point, she said, yeah, and one of the doctors said that he couldn't get into my cardiovascular system because my veins are too tiny. Sabom looked up the medical report, and it said, quote, her veins and arteries are too small to get in that way. We had to go in through another way. On and on and on it went. Now, that's a brain that is dead. She shouldn't be having any conscious experiences, let alone being able to verify corroborations in the room. And guys, the literature is coming out on this. The data are showing that there's case after case after case. And the thing that gets me on this, there was a case years ago of a young boy who said, I went to heaven, and they made a movie and a book. Later he came out and said, I made up the whole thing. Yeah. He didn't have any veridical experience. Like, I knew this happened, I knew that happened. He just said, I went to see Jesus. And if you read the book, you're like, this doesn't sound like what the Bible teaches. Well, he was lying. Okay, there's liars. But what was his motive? He was trying to get money. He was trying to sell books, and he did. There's cases from people who are professionals, professors, lawyers, doctors, that for them to come out and say, I had this experience, actually would make them look foolish in their academic or career field. There's no profit motive. They don't want to write a book. They don't want to go on TV. They just are being interviewed and saying, yes, this is what happened. Minimally, if your brain is shut off, there is no EEG, there is no EKG, your heart isn't pumping, then minimally, you should have no conscious thoughts. So it seems to me that this is good evidence for the soul. Well, how would we explain this in a clear way? We went through a lot of material. Let's see if we can kind of bring all this together in a concrete way. If I was having a discussion with a person and they said, I don't believe in the soul, questions to answer. If matter and energy do not think or make decisions, what makes humans different? Matter and energy don't think, then do we think? Are we thinking right now? If you cannot know something as basic as your own thoughts, then what can you know? I think if someone is saying to me, you can't even know what you're seeing in front of you, it reminds me of the Marx Brothers. Don't trust what your eyes see, trust me. It's like, no, I can see it for myself, and I'm perceiving the world around me. It's all very, very clear. For somebody to say that, if I said, yeah, you're right, our consciousness isn't real, then what other aspects of my life are wrong? If free will is an illusion, who or what is being deluded? The very fact that you're being deluded shows that you have a conscious self, because rocks can't get deluded. You can't perform an illusion on a rock, but you can on a conscious agent. How much evidence would you need to discount your direct first-person perception? I'm thinking a lot. What kind of defeater would you have to give? The Benjamin Libet study? That's the best you got? Like, that's it? That's the only thing you got is one study showing free will? Oh man, I'm thinking it's got to be something incredible. Maybe like coming out of the Matrix or something. Like to say that all my perceptions are false. Why pay such a high intellectual price? Like at a certain point, and I say this with all seriousness, at a certain point, if you're a naturalist and you're saying, no, I'm committed to naturalism, but that makes me think that I need to deny my own thoughts. My first-person perspective is that I don't have a first-person perspective. My conscious thought is that I'm not conscious. And my free-willed thought is that I don't have free will. I think at a certain point you have to ask, do you have the wrong worldview? All right, that being said, if we have a soul, and I think there's strong evidence that we do, this gives a strong plausibility structure for the unique creation of human beings. This doesn't prove an original human pair, but what this does do is it shows us that that is a plausible idea, that God coming into the world to give humans a soul, that would show us that God intervened. The details would be fuzzy, but the present would lead to the past, showing us that, yeah, this is indeed real.